If you've been struggling trying to find your perfect snare sound, this video is going to be a great step-by-step guide to diagnose what problems you might have. Today I'm going to be replacing the top and bottom head on my Yamaha Live Custom 14-inch by 5.5-inch snare drum. Through this process, I'll show you some basic maintenance that you can do on your drum, as well as tuning tips and how to properly put new heads on a snare drum. As you're going through this process, I recommend that you have 2 drum keys. This is going to make tuning much quicker and easier. When we're starting out with putting new heads on a snare drum, I always like to start with the bottom head. So when you're going to be addressing stuff with the bottom head, I like to make sure that I loosen my snares a little bit and then flip the drum over. And in order to remove this bottom head, we have to get the snares off of the drum. So on this particular snare drum, you can use a drum key to loosen the screws that are on the butt plate and take the snares off. It's important to mention that one thing that is really going to contribute to having a good snare sound is making sure that you have quality snare wires. I really like Pure Sound snare wires. These are just the typical 20-strand Pure Sound snare wires, and I use the plastic strap instead of string, but these have a great sound, and especially if you're just running a stock snare drum or a cheaper snare drum, upgrading those snare wires will really help the sound. So after you have removed the snare wires, make sure you set those in a safe place. And we're going to start by removing the bottom head here. Now, as I'm going around and removing this head, I like to use 2 keys, one on either side, and just kind of slowly loosen the head. When you're doing this, you want to make sure that you're not loosening one lug by itself a bunch and taking a lot of tension off of one lug, because it's going to pull on the rim unevenly and pull on the head unevenly as well. As long as you're using 2 keys and you're staying on opposite sides of the drum the whole time and kind of slowly bringing it down in tension, everything will go nice and smooth. As you're loosening each individual tension rod here, you can kind of take note of if there's any tension rods that feel a little stiffer than the others as they're coming out, because that might mean that you might need some lubrication on those threads to make sure that it's nice and smooth when it goes back in. You can also take note of any lugs or tension rods that appear to be damaged. Once you have all the tension rods out of the lugs, you can remove the bottom rim and head. This is a great time to check out the bearing edge of the drum here. It has been honestly a long time since I've changed the resonant head on my snare drum. Now, the bottom heads you don't need to change nearly as frequently because the stick is never coming into contact with that. But over time, the head gets stretched out and loses a lot of its resonance. In all honesty, I think it's been at least 3 years since I've changed the bottom head on this snare drum, so it is about time that we get a new head on this thing. At this point in time, I like to check out the bottom rim and just make sure that there's no grime or anything underneath the edge here, the part of the rim that's going to be making contact with the drum head. Sometimes there might be some lint or some dirt built up under here, so it's nice to make sure that's clean. You can even use a small rag to wipe that off. And the same thing with the bearing edge of the drum. You can kind of wipe this with your finger and get any dust or particles off of this. I am noticing that right when I took the bottom head off, there was actually like some lint and some little fuzzies that fell into the drum itself. So you can kind of just flip this over, get anything out that was in there, and check out the bearing edge, make sure there's no dings or cracks in the shell itself. Everything's looking good. At this point in time, you could also take typically a Phillips head screwdriver and tighten any screws on the inside of the drum that appear to be loose. If you notice when you're playing on your snare that there's like some rattling noises taking place, sometimes these screws on the inside can loosen themselves, and then the individual washers that are attached to the screws can be rattling against the shell of the drum. Make sure to not over tighten these though. You just want to make sure that they're snug and staying tight. The head that I originally had on this drum was a Remo Ambassador snare side, and I'm going to put the exact same head on this drum. Now, because this is a a drum set snare, you don't need a resonant head that is extremely thin, like a diplomat style. For concert snare drums, you want as much sensitivity and articulation as possible. For drum set snares, you're going to be playing some loud backbeats and rim shots, so having a resonant head that is slightly thicker than the thinnest possible tends to work pretty well. These Ambassador snare side heads by Remo, I believe, are 3 mils thick, and they work really, really nice. So when I put the head on my snare drum, I like to make sure that the logo is lined up on whatever the opposite side of the drum that I play on is. When I set up my snare drum, I have the throw off between my legs, and so I always like the logo to be on the opposite edge of the drum there. If you have an older snare drum especially, this would be a great time to use some lubrication in the lugs here. White lithium grease works really well for this. You can just put a little bit of white lithium grease in each of these lug casings here. And that way, as the tension rods are being tightened, they're lubricating themselves as they go into the lugs. When you're reinstalling the bottom rim, make sure you take note of where the openings are for the actual snare wires to pass through. These need to be aligned on the snare bed of the snare drum. One thing I should mention is the majority of styles that I play tend to be rock, pop, or funk. I do a lot of jazz gigs and Latin drumming as well. I don't tend to play very heavy styles like metal or anything like that, and I'm not a very hard hitter to begin with. So tuning definitely involves a lot of personal preference based on the styles you play or the sound that you like. But one thing tends to be pretty universal, and that is on the bottom head of the snare drum, we want to make sure that it is cranked up pretty high to allow for maximum snare response. And with a nice tight bottom head, this allows your top head to be at virtually any tuning range and still sound very good. Okay, I've placed the bottom head and bottom rim back on the drum. I'm gonna go around and finger tighten each of these tuning rods right now. So I'm just gonna take my fingers and tighten these tuning rods each as much as I can. Again, I like to stay on opposite sides of the drum just to make sure I'm bringing everything up equally, and also making sure that the rim is still staying even on the head. As you're finger tightening these tension rods, you can kind of take note of which tension rods have a little bit more friction in them. Some of them you might not be able to fully finger tighten. If it gets stuck halfway through, you might have to take a drum key and just get it past that thread or put some lubrication on it. Now that I've gone around and finger tightened these tension rods as much as I can, I don't necessarily like to fully seat the bottom head, which means putting a lot of pressure in the middle of the head and pushing down. And the reason being is bottom heads of snare drums are so much thinner and more delicate than the top heads. But what I am going to do is, as I go around, I'm going to put a little pressure on each of the edges of the rim by each of these tuning rods, and that's going to allow me to get a couple more rotations out of each of these tuning rods just by putting pressure on the rim there. So I'm still slowly bringing up the tension of this bottom head equally, making sure that nothing is stretching out weird or warping. Okay, I'm going to start bringing this bottom head up to pitch now, again using both drum keys, starting on opposite sides of the rim, and I'm just doing about 1 to 2 full turns each as we're going around, trying to bring everything up equally. I'm also looking at the head and seeing if there's any ripples that are showing in the head. That means that one particular spot on the head is significantly looser than another spot on the head. So you just want to make sure you get rid of the ripples as you're going around. And we're going to end up kind of pitch matching each of these lugs anyways. So I'm not keeping an exact count of the number of turns I'm doing on each of these drum keys, but trying to keep it relatively similar. I'm also taking note as I'm doing this, like how do each of these tension rods feel? Does one feel significantly tighter than the other one? Does one feel really loose? Because they should feel relatively the same as we're going around. As the head really starts to come up to pitch, I only like to do smaller turns of the key. So let's kind of see where we're at pitch-wise. Ideally, we want all of these tension rods to have a similar pitch when we're going around to make sure that the drum is in tune with itself. So what you can do is take your finger or a drumstick and lightly tap right next to where each of these tension rods are. And what I'm listening for is which is the highest tension rod pitch, and I want to use that as my reference and try to bring everything up to that. As you're bringing up the head, if you hear a little bit of cracking sounds, that's just the glue in the head getting worked in, so don't be too frightened by that. So I'm hearing this lug over here as one of the higher pitches, so I'm gonna go around and any lug that I hear that is lower than that pitch, bring it up a little bit. All right, that's pretty close for now. Now again, the tension that we want our bottom head to be, pretty much regardless of what style or what tuning range you're gonna have your snare drum be at, we want it to be relatively tight. You can hear the pitch of this head right now. If I mute the top head by putting my hand underneath the snare, that's the pitch we're at right now, and it feels pretty tight to the touch as well. So now we're gonna reinstall the snare wires, and this is where things can get a little bit tricky. So we wanna make sure that when we're putting these snare wires on the snare wires themselves are equal between both edges of the drum. So as you position these snare wires back onto the snare, we just wanna make sure that it's staying within the halfway point on the drum. So I'm gonna go through and reattach these plastic straps to the butt plates here. Again, I'm making sure that the snares are pretty much even between both sides of the drum there. And then I'm gonna take my drum key and tighten down the screws that are holding the butt plate in place. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I like to make sure that I actually loosen the tension of my snare wires before I reinstall the snare wires. Ideally, you don't want your snare strainer to be at maximum tension or minimum tension. You want it to be kind of in the middle so you have some flexibility based on whether you want to tighten or loosen your snares. So I have my snare throw off engaged right now, but I backed off the tension a lot. And the side that is connected to the butt plate is already tightened. I'm just gonna take my hand, pull on the strap here to tighten these snares, and then I'm gonna tighten the bolts here. And what this is doing is already giving some tension on the snare wires themselves. So just by tapping on the bottom head, you can hear that this tension is too loose for the snare wires. I'm gonna flip the drum over, bring up the tension a little bit. So I brought up the tension a little bit on the snare wires, and now we have this sort of a sound. That's getting a nice articulate response. We'll go with that for now. All right, now that we have our bottom head placed on the drum and tuned up, the snare wires reinstalled, it's time to change the top head. Now this is a pretty big day for me because in my entire drumming career, from when I was 8 years old until now, I have pretty much only played on coated ambassadors or fiber skin ambassadors for my smaller jazz combo gigs. Today I'm actually gonna try a new sound. I'm gonna go for a controlled sound by Remo. And the reason being is, especially now that I have this YouTube channel and I'm doing more drum covers and playing different styles and some more backbeat oriented music, I want something that's gonna have a little bit more durability and thickness in the middle of the head and slightly reduced overtones. Plus, it's just gonna be really exciting for me to try out a new head. So just like the bottom head, I'm gonna go through the same process and take this top head off, put both my keys on opposite sides of the head, fully loosen this, take the rim and the head off, and see what we have. All right, just like the bottom head, we're gonna take the top head off. Check out the rim, get any sort of debris off the rim, and do the same thing for the bearing edge. And we're gonna install this top head very similarly to what we did with the bottom head. Place it on. Again, I like to line up my logo opposite to where the snare strainer is because I put the snare strainer between my legs when I play. Place the rim back on, then finger tighten all the tension rods. Again, if there were any tension rods that were kind of stiff when they were going in, you can use some white lithium grease in those lugs for lubrication. Now with top heads, because they're significantly more durable than bottom heads, I do like to seat these heads, which again just means you press in the center of the head to stretch it out a little bit. And again, you can hear the glue kind of being broken apart a little bit. That's totally normal. After I've done that, again, kind of just bring it up a little bit with the fingers on the tension rods. And now we're gonna start bringing this head up to pitch with our drum keys. Again, opposite sides of the head and bring it up equally. As you're bringing it up, you can press on it again, seat it again. Once it has a little bit more tension, stretch it out, work it in even more. All right, let's see where we're at with the individual tension rods here. As I'm doing this, I like to take my opposite hand and dampen the bottom head so I can more clearly hear the pitch of the top head. So I'm hearing these two lugs especially. This one especially seems to be the highest pitch, so I'm going to try to bring everything else up to meet that pitch. And as I'm doing this, you can hear the head cracking and popping a little bit. Again, that's normal, especially with Remo drum heads. If you find that you have one tension rod that is significantly higher than everything else, you can also back the tension off of that rod. And that's actually what I'm going to do on this one and the opposite side as well, just a little bit. All right, all of the lugs are about equal now. Let's see what we have for a sound. And without the snares on, we're around this pitch. So in general, I like to have my snares at a medium-high tension. So this is still significantly lower in pitch than I would normally have. So I'm gonna bring the overall pitch of the drum up now. And I'm just gonna take my drum key and give an equal amount of turns to each tension rod. That sounds pretty good to me where I tend to like to have my snare drums. Let's put this over on the drum set and see what sort of sounds we have within the mix now. All right, we're on the kit. I have brought the top and the bottom head up just a little bit more from where we left off. It is important to note as you play on a drum head, it's going to stretch over time. So especially when you put on new heads, you might have to tune them up after a couple days of playing because they will stretch out and start to seat themselves on the drum. Wow, to my ears, that has a really big, aggressive sound. This Yamaha Live Custom snare drum has a really solid rim shot sound to begin with, and then this head really livens things up. For a live scenario where I wouldn't have anything close mic'd, this is a totally usable sound that I like. For the purpose of having all these close mics and for getting a nice recording sound, I think I am gonna add one or two moon gels, and let's see what that does to the sound. Let's see where we're at now. And there you have it, a great sounding snare. I hope you found these tips helpful in your journey to finding a better snare drum sound. Let me know down in the comments if you enjoyed the content. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you everyone so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.